pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountainside. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you must go, and I must bide. But come ye back when summer's in the meadow.
Hello everyone. You've just been listening to the song Danny Boy, set to the tune of Derry Air or Londonderry Air. It's the unofficial anthem of Northern Ireland, and I give two names for the tune because, like many things in Northern Ireland, there are two very different perspectives. It can of course be a good thing to have different perspectives on issues in life, but the polarisation of these perspectives led to 30 years of violence in the north. My guest today is John Harding. John was born in Wales and lived much of his life in England before relocating to Ireland around 20 years ago. He was a priest and creative writer who became involved in running peace and reconciliation groups in the north. John was visiting and I took the opportunity to ask him what that work was like in a place that's so polarised and has suffered so much trauma. Previous guest Rob Blake was also visiting, and you will hear him chip in with a question at the end. So here's John explaining how he became involved in peace and reconciliation work.
My mother died for a number of years, about 7 years ago, and I picked up one of her letters that she had written to my father, who was in Italy at the time. That was before I was born. And she was writing about this baby who she was carrying. And her hope was that maybe this baby would be a person of peace, especially coming out of this world war. And that extraordinary revelation for her was a revelation for me, because always through my life I've sought for peace. Not because I just want folk not to argue, but try to find a way through by which we can continue a useful relationship. And so the watershed for me was, well, my background is through engineering. It went into farming and youth work. I was 8 years on the road as a gospel band. Then I took up training for the Anglican ministry in Nottingham. And so for 18 years I became a parish priest after being a curate. But in '97 my first wife died, and that was a watershed for me. And my sister, who was living in the centre of Ireland in Athlone, just rang up one day and said, "Why not come over for a holiday? You might not return." And so that's actually what happened. So I lived with them for a little while. And during that time, I met Katie on a peace conference. And Katie is now my wife, and we have a little girl, Esther, age 12. But Katie was involved in peace and reconciliation work. And my being English, really, and coming over to Ireland, I actually knew nothing about the Irish story, really, except for the propaganda that the BBC had given me, delightfully over the years. And what I discovered is that when facilitating different groups to enable them to talk about their history, I didn't need to know anything. And in fact, I was in a very powerful place of not knowing anything. So my opening gambit was, here's John, who knows nothing, please teach me. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating through all the different groups, from Catholic to Protestant, Unionists and Republicans and so on. All these different people telling me their story. And that gave me an education to what was going on at the grassroots in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland and so on, that these stories actually had a resonance of authenticity, whereas what comes through the news is really very selective and usually has a political slant to it, which I was always very cagey about.
So are you south of the border down in Athlone running these groups at the moment, or are they taking place in the north?
My work didn't actually start south of the border. I had moved to the north.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I
Right.
actually started. Because it was then that the Glencree Centre of Peace and Reconciliation asked us both to do a piece of work called the Churches Programme. And the Churches Programme was getting together people who had something to say about church. That didn't mean that they had to be churchgoers, but everybody has something to say about church. And that's what we were asked to do. So we would be able to bring Catholics and Protestants and Presbyterians and all shades together, and people who didn't aspire to any faith, just to bring them together in the same room, because we all felt that sectarianism is actually born out of religion. That's its seedbed, and so we don't bang people over the head with that, but it is a place to start. And so with the Glencree Centre of Peace and Reconciliation backing, we started field work along the border. Now, the border in Northern and the Republic of Ireland is 250 miles long, so it's quite a long space. And we would hold meetings of groups that were either side, because often it is at the border where the greatest pain is. And so we would build up over the period of years, those contacts and the trust between the peoples as we were going there. There were 3 of us who actually worked the whole of that border.
So what does this look like when you have a meeting? Is it people sat around in a circle, Protestant, Catholic? Well, what's the sort of format?
Yeah. We would go out from one church to another to say, would you be interested in a conversation? So that's all it is, without any outcome at all, just to speak to another group, maybe another type of church or different body of people, and would they be interested? So there was that sort of research that had to be done. And slowly but surely we build up the contacts. The main work that Katie and I had to do was to design the question. Nobody wants answers, and there's no answers to the Irish question at all. But a good question has to be personal, it has to be community-based, and it has to be ambiguous. So if I wanted to give you an example of that, I could say, Richard, what are you doing about what young people say that adults aren't hearing? So I'm asking you as the personal, young people is the corporate, and the questions they are asking that our adults aren't hearing, what are they? So there's no answer to that, but it's a very good way to get a conversation going. So a lot of what we would do is spend time finding the right question for that group, and then just simply asking them.
Okay, yeah, when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned now, let me get this right, you asked people to think about what question they would want to be asked by someone on the other side?
Yes, so if we had, say, a Catholic group and a Protestant group together, I might separate the 2 groups and just ask one group, what question would you like the other group to ask you, And why is that question important to you? So they would both be doing that, and they would be saying, now, I would like to ask them to ask me about the Immaculate Conception or something. Why is that important?
It's not obviously important to, you know, the first glance, right? So, what would they come up with?
Yes. So why would that be important to them? So the moment they start asking why that would be important, they realise that actually it wasn't a very important question. So they would find another question, and slowly but surely, it used to shake down to some fairly fundamental and really important questions, like how can we share our education with each other? Because we're all concerned about children's education. So that was important. And how do we actually live in harmony, or how do we live with each other's history? And you know, these sort of things started coming up rather than some doctrinal stuff, which, you know,
Okay, and what kind of people would walk through the door into these things? And what I'm asking here is, sometimes the kind of criticism of interfaith movements is they end up, as I've heard them described, as liberal cocktail parties, right? Where they tend to attract people who are very open to reconciliation and seeing the other's point of view to begin with. So I imagine those people did come, but did you have people also who were more entrenched in their views and kind of they're sort of slightly unwillingly, they thought it's a good idea, but they didn't expect to get much out of it? And what kind of people would it attract?
yes, church people. Also we ran another group which is slightly out of it with young people, and then we put them all together, and that made a very interesting mix, because the young people had a very fresh way of actually speaking that was important that the older folk would be able to hear. But again, there was just a huge variety of people. There were folk who were, I know a number of people who were from the paramilitary, people who had had lost loved ones and were part of the victims' support groups and so on. Everybody knew somebody who had, I mean, there were 3,500 people who had killed over the years there. And I mean, we've just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Omagh bombing, which was the biggest atrocity in the whole of the Troubles. 29 people died, and 30 and 31 were two twins that weren't born. So that was in there. There were also a group of kids who were Spanish. So it would cut right across the board, and it wasn't actually focused on anybody except just a population. It was a disaster. So everybody knew somebody who, or had a friend who had lost somebody. Everybody heard the explosion. So if that was the minimum thing, that it affected you, because in your imagination you had probably seen all sorts of stuff on television anyway. And that would infect the narrative of the community. And that, I think, is very important, because communities do have a narrative that goes right back into ancestry and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's a striking thing about the north of Ireland. I've been there quite a lot over the years, and everyone has a story which would be totally exceptional if they lived anywhere else.
Yes,
okay?
yeah.
But there it's normal. Everyone's got a story like that, of being involved in or close to some incident of incredible violence, or having lost people there. But okay, so when you say people from paramilitary groups came along, that's pretty extreme on the spectrum, I would think. Okay, so what kind of changes in perspective did you see through the work? Did you see people who were quite entrenched to begin with opening up to, I don't know, a more reconciliatory point of view, or seeing the other's perspective?
Yes and no. Many people, it was just exactly the forum that they had always looked for. I mean, one of the things that Katie and I are really hot on is creating a safe space. by which people could make unsafe statements. So often in churches or whatever, everybody's wanting a nice safe space where we can be all cozy. But this is very different. So you could have a conversation where there was quite a lot of anger. But part of the skill of the facilitators in that was to be able to contain or hold that and allow that to happen without it getting completely out of hand. And in order to, we'd have a number of guidelines which we'd give people right at the beginning. So this is how the conversation works. Somebody is allowed to speak, then, and the facilitator can interrupt. So that's one of the things, then they know that. So you won't be able to speak for the next hour. So we won't allow that. But we'll ask you to speak, and everybody else to be there to listen and give the respect to that. That's how that person sees their life and their context and their situation and their pain or joys. And when that's been said, then somebody else can speak. And it was a facilitator's skills of actually being able to bring that into some useful conclusion or forum. What we discovered is that people went out glad to have spoken. And I think if I'm in a situation where folk can say, I have been listened to respectfully, and that is healing. You know, so often people are jabbering over you or, you know, swilling pints down and not listening. How do I know that I've been heard by you? And one of the ways that we really worked at is, can I will only be heard if somebody is speaking into my listening. If I can know how you're listening to me, then I can change my language or redirect my language in a way that you will understand. But if I'm just coming out with my own story and rote, which I've done 1,000 times, you'll be bored and so will I. and it just doesn't move on. So part of the facilitation work was actually, how will this group hear the other group? And in the respect and the silence often that there was, people suddenly discovered that they were able to shift out of their normal rote story, which not only they knew, but the other side knew as well. So everybody knew each other's story. That wasn't the problem. Was how do we actually move the action forward into a new conversation? And when that starts, then there's some very interesting things start to happen. And you start finding friendships being happening, and it's just tentative stuff. But yes, that's how it seemed to develop.
I just want to examine that a little more there. What does that look like, that shift from me telling you my typical story to what you're aiming to get? Is it a sense of more authenticity coming from me in expression?
I'm not expecting anything from you. All I'm doing is just probably holding up a mirror so that you can actually tell your story and hear your own story from your own lips. That's the best I think I could do. Everything would be a prescription that this is what I want you to go, where I want you to go, or what I want you to do. And I want you to throw your arms around that paramilitary and say, I forgive you. That's nonsensical. That doesn't work. And if it did, then I would be quite skeptical of it, because actually the forgiveness of, say, your wife being killed or whatever, that's the last thing on the agenda. So I would, what I have seen is people weeping. I've seen men embrace each other. People at the end of, say, a weekend's meeting, standing up and giving testimony of how they have been changed and their attitudes have been changed. I've seen people stand up and walk out in fury. That's okay too. You know, part of the guidelines is that if you don't want to be in the room, that's fine. And don't anybody chase after them either. Allow that to happen. And I think that's to do with giving people respect for their yes and their no. If somebody can't say no, then actually their yes means nothing. And vice versa. If I always have to say no to something, then what does the yes mean? So those sort of things are there. And if you dig down deeper, you will find that within the families of father and children and grandchildren, there is a big no going on there, that you are not allowed to meet up with little Jimmy down the road, or Paul, or William, or whatever. You're not allowed to meet them. And there's that sort of family thing there as well. And one of the things we've always wanted to do is to actually do work with families, so that families can really talk to each other about the way that their language has been closed down because of the Troubles. And you can see the dangers that people faced and wanted to overcome, but the cost of doing that could be your life. So it has to be very, very sensitively and carefully administered and listened to, and so on, and take it very slowly. You know, the Troubles didn't happen yesterday and could be solved today. They go back to Strongbow, which is sort of 800 years ago, whatever it is. You know, it's that sort of stuff. Yeah.
So as I said at the start, Northern Ireland is like a microcosm for the kind of division you see everywhere, but a more intense one where it's descended into violence. Do you see a role for these kind of groups in areas where you don't have that level of intensity? For example, with Brexit in the UK, we seem to have a situation where one half of the country is utterly incapable of understanding the other, and vice versa. Okay, and they're talking from a very different narrative, whereas what the European Union means to people, they're talking about two different things. It's either this vision of a future of everyone coming together and cooperating and overcoming the past wars and violence of Europe, or it's an oligarchical control system that's going to be very removed from the people and be there to pass money on to corporations. So there's these two very different visions there. You could say the same thing with Mr. Trump in America, whether he's a liberator who's going to cut back government and simplify the tax code and return America to what it was 50 years ago, or a narcissist who has no concern whatsoever for the poor and downtrodden of the earth. And there's this total polarization in that. But we only seem to move to doing these kind of groups when it's something like Israel-Palestine or the north of Ireland, where things have actually descended into chaos. Do you see a wider role for this kind of facilitated dialogue?
Well, the work that the Glencree Centre of Peace and Reconciliation, they're based just south of Dublin, but they actually do facilitation work around the world. And part of the rationale is that because we were able to do quite a lot of work actually in Northern Ireland and through with the Troubles and actually working that sort of facilitation, that actually built up the skills of those folk in Northern Ireland to be able to facilitate other folk. And the great thing about it is that if somebody from Northern Ireland comes into Palestine and talks to folk there, in a sense they have no axe to grind other than just, we'd like to see you talk to each other. And there's no political stuff to it. Part of the problems with much of the like the Brexit stuff is that there's too much politics and horse trading going on behind the scene, and it's not transparent. What Katie and I were involved with, and so the Glencree Centre of Peace and Reconciliation, is that they were non-political. And although we did get money from the state and so on. We actually had the freedom to draw together who we wished. And yes, people could talk about politics, but it wasn't with any back story to try and make you toe the line or whatever, and be at peace with your neighbor. If you couldn't be at peace with your neighbor, fine, but at least you're aware of it. And I think if you are aware of your neighbor, then you're halfway there.
Thank you very much for that, John. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's probably...
Okay, thank you. I'll ask a bonus question, actually, which I might slip in afterwards. Yeah.
I like that.
Because it's things that don't necessarily fall into the...
the
that you
train
feel
of
like maybe I've
thought,
done it right, but actually sometimes you get like, okay, we've had a flow, we've come to the conclusion, but I'd actually like to ask this question. It sort of refers to what you said about the BBC, okay, presenting a narrative. And when I've listened to these kind of groups in Palestine, what becomes clear is that there's a very different factual narrative held between Israelis and Palestinians. So Palestinians, the origin of this problem starts with the Nakaba, right, where 800,000 of them were driven from their homes by Israeli tanks. And there were atrocities committed, there were mass rapes, there were people put up against walls and shot, Palestinians put up against walls and shot. The Israelis don't necessarily know about this, okay, and they don't necessarily think it happened. They have a different account. And I think history has concluded on one side or the other. The Palestinian account is objectively more accurate, I would say, at this point. You've had Israeli historians concede this, and maybe the point of argument is about the righteousness of coming in and taking that land, whether it was justified or not. But for the average Israeli citizen, when they hear Palestinians tell them about what happened to their parents, their grandparents, they're sitting there thinking, is this something that they've made up to try and steal a bit of land from us, okay, or to justify their actions now? And I can understand if you've never been exposed to that narrative, that's your thought. And I wonder how that comes across, or does it come across in the North, that you have people speaking from, and they've got a very different factual narrative in mind? Because I think that's something that it often evokes a sense of exasperation, in the sense that, well, if people don't share the same facts, and you see this said a lot in America now, okay, with Donald Trump coming out with terms like alternative facts, and people laugh about it and say, look, as a society, we have to agree on the factual narrative, and then we can agree on what to do about it. But I think the concept of alternative facts it's not some new thing, okay? People have always had different ways of seeing the world, and that means interpreting it differently and coming up with different facts. It's just Donald Trump has come up with a name for it, and people laugh at Donald Trump. I'm not saying his use of it is particularly the most, whatever, but how do you encounter that kind of thing when people are coming in and saying that, with a different kind of historical account of what happened? Did that occur?
I think everybody has a different historical take, because we only understand the world in the context of our own lives. And depending on what has actually happened to us, then we will create the mythology around it. And we will make sure that our neighbours know that mythology, but it doesn't go very much further than that. And part of the work, I think, of the facilitation was to try and bring down, say, well, okay, this happened. Can you see it any other way? And the person say, no, that's exactly what happened. I said, anybody else were there when this happened? Can you shed light on this, what would be a factual thing? I think there was research done on how accidents were seen, and depending where you were on the road or pavement, you gave a different account. Oh, it was that person's fault, but actually someone else can see it slightly different. That's just a simple illustration of actually something far deeper, which actually includes the family or the tribal narrative. and all the constraints that that has on freedom of speech, really. So I don't know whether that's answering that. I didn't see, if we did see what you're talking about, different factual or fake news or whatever, we would immediately see that as a possibility of discussion. That would be absolute gold dust. Great, you see it that way, you see it differently. Let's explore that. And when Katie and I started off, we would not know where we were going to go. We had no, all our concerns is that actually we wouldn't have killed each other by the end of the event. That actually somehow people had a chance to listen, whatever the story was. That's all food to the narrative and so on. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do another bonus question. Do you have any sense of what impact this had when people left the groups and went back to their own communities, both on an individual level, but also, I don't know how many people you did this work with, but not just you, there's other people doing it.
Certainly, yeah.
What do you feel, I don't know, it's a very hard thing to quantify, but what do you feel the impact was of?
I wouldn't know. But I tell you one thing, I've been a creative writing facilitator for a trust called the Pushkin Trust. Mm-hmm. And right in the middle of the Troubles, the Pushkin Trust came out of the Duchess of Abercorn, who was related to Alexander Pushkin, that she lives in a very nice manor and so on. And her daughter, who was very young then, went to her one day and said, all these children in Belfast are just being blown to bits and throwing rocks and so on. And here we are sitting amongst the beauty of Newton Stewart and County Tyrone, 80 miles away from Belfast. Isn't there something we can do? And so the Duchess of Abercorn started to think about this, and she started this Pushkin Trust, where she got she went into the schools, or got contacts with the schools of north and the south of the border, Catholic, Protestant, right across the mix, and invited maybe 4 schools for a day to come together. And you might have the sort of the top end of the primary schools, as it were, to come together to experience the beauty of her estate. And on that estate, they would do environmental walks. That would maybe in the morning or the afternoon. The other part of the program was that the children might do something to do with creative writing, they might do artwork, they might do music or something. And so I was part of the facilitation there, doing drama and music and creative writing. And I've done that for 10, 12, 15 years now. Each year they'd have these Pushkin days. So her work was to try and get education across the board, and kids discovering that actually, if they were Protestant, Catholics didn't have 2 heads, they had 3, or
That doesn't good point to make about the North, that people can live right next to each other and never meet each other on different estates.
Exactly, yes. So she was able to do that and bring them together. And through that basic education, not only were they being brought together, but the teachers were as well, because the teachers had to be there and they had to be part of the program. And it's just been, well, I think we just celebrated nearly the 30th year the Pushkin has been going. How many children do they have going through a year? Well over 1,000. Now that, year in, year on, is absolutely brilliant. And that goes on underneath. What has just started happening is children who first came 30 years ago are coming back as facilitators and expressing how their lives were totally and utterly changed by the Pushkin program. And the Pushkin program was not prescriptive in any way. We'd never say, right, this is what we want you to learn, but what would you like to learn about the environment? And the kids would start talking and inquiring and so on, and suddenly find that all the children were interested in that tree rather than somehow the colour, the school uniform they were wearing or whatever. That was not an issue. And so out of that has come great change. And the teachers have teachers' days as well, by which we can actually rethink the way we teach. I mean, the word education means to draw forth. It doesn't mean to stuff in. And so often we're up to here in stats, trying to get the children to, comply with what the government want. But where we start is that actually the child has it all, has the wisdom there. All we have to do is facilitate them and bring it forth. And that is a different way of actually looking at education. And it's something I think teachers originally felt, but then suddenly the program and the institution has squashed that out.
Beaten out of them by the state education system. And
then the whole thing comes on this sort of wheel, which they can't break out of. And so it's been an absolute delight for them to come to be facilitated into a completely new thing and just remember what it was when they first had the vision of teaching.
Wonderful that the Trust has that underpinning philosophy to it.
Yes. It's just delightful.
Thank you.
Can I ask a bonus question? I'm just interested in all that richness of your work. How do you see a link between peace in the outer world and an inner peace?
Pass.
Excellent. Coffee?
No, I think we get to know who we are by what other people tell or say to us. We do get a sense of who I am by how you react to me. And if everybody is shouting at me, then I get a sense that I'm not a very nice person or something, So what I've found in the whole process, or the education that I received through the peace and reconciliation work, is I didn't give anything into that. Everybody gave it to me. That actually when I first came to Northern Ireland, I was petrified. I thought I was going to be blown up as well. But these people actually brought me peace to say, we've lived here, we know the problems, you're safe with us. And so that gave me, that was a gift given to me as I sought to give them my ignorance, really.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, so that's how I think it worked. Yeah. And some people say, well, would you go back to England again? I said, no, this is my home. The resonance of the place is so deep within me that I wouldn't. I remember standing on Athlone Bridge where the Shannon goes past, standing there and saying, this is my home. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And that's, people have to put up with that.
This is the paradox of the north of Ireland for me. I'm not the only one that's observed this. It's the nicest place I've ever been.
Yeah.
Friendliest place I've ever been. Walking around Belfast, you can't get a map out without someone coming and showing you where you want to go.
That's normal, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's the side that's not obvious if you don't go there,
Yes. No, and I mean, we can talk about the troubles, but the joys that have spawned out of it is amazing. I mean, it's just wonderful to meet the people who have got excuse to be sad about their lives, actually finding joy there. And when my first wife, Ros, died, somebody sent me a letter which said, it's hard to keep joy out of your life forever. And that stayed with me like a mantra. And that's perfect. It's hard to keep it out.
Well, thank you for listening, everyone. John mentioned the Pushkin Trust, and I shall link to the website for that below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do subscribe, as I'll be doing similar themes in the future. And also John himself will be coming back on to talk about the series of novels he's written. Now here's some Danny Boy to play us out.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling from glen to glen and down the mountain side. The summer's gone and all the roses falling. 'Tis you